All right. Welcome, everybody. This is the March 23rd meeting of the Service Mesh Interface Community Meeting. We got a couple of agenda topics, starting with Mike talking about Gateway API.
All right. So yeah, my full-time focus is on Gateway API currently. And during the last weekly meeting, I was chatting with some of the maintainers afterwards, and they were expressed interest in hearing about other use cases. So I know like Istio is doing something different with HTTP route for the way that they're handling traffic to like URL destinations as opposed to just Kubernetes services. But yeah, I mentioned that we're exploring using HTTP route as well for SMI spec, and mentioned some of the identity binding stuff that you've been working on too. And yeah, they expressed interest in hearing about that use case if we are interested in presenting in their weekly meeting at any point.
Fantastic. Sounds like there's an invitation that has been extended from one of our sibling communities, which is fantastic.
Yeah, there was this general conversation about like an interest in collaborating more closely to kind of like make sure we're all on the same page between Gateway API, what's happening over here with SMI spec, and what's happening over in SIG multi-cluster too, because it feels like they're all adjacent problem areas, and making sure that we're able to coordinate on things that make sense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It comes a time in the life cycle of a project or of a set of communities where it's opportunities to collapse and to not have to compete for standards. And I think we're at that point for a lot of these efforts. So that's really exciting. I started. I was at the community meeting on Monday, but I had to drop off a little late for me. But if I know kind of ahead of time, I think it's Monday at 5. Mondays at 5 p.m. Central. I should be able to make that in chat. I need to go back and sniff out that agenda because yeah, I'd love to collaborate.
Awesome, sounds good.
Yeah, I think I created the issue on the possibility of doing the merge. I'm not 100% how easy it's going to be. There was some definite differences in the way that like the topology, which might cause issues. And then it's kind of like, how does that tie in around the whole security thing? Because but I think it's definitely possible.
Yeah, and I'm happy to provide additional context on like the security model the Gateway API is using with like how they have like a two-way handshake for being able to send traffic across namespaces and stuff like that. So
yeah, you mentioned, Mike, you mentioned Istio before. I linked to one of their use cases of the Gateway API in Slack a week ago. They've got a very what is it, like a policy or a parent ref for of type mesh for the name of Istio. I think that's that we could maybe look at that pattern as a way to kind of delegate, to like signal the Gateway API to delegate traffic to the mesh. And to your point, Nick, about collapsing with HTTP route, I think that because there are some changes to topology, there's also a change in that the Gateway API HTTP route is not just a declaration of possible routes. It's also like where you would do traffic splitting. It's kind of all flat in one manifest, which is a bit from like a cluster resource perspective, seems a bit less verbose than kind of how SMI is currently handling it, where you've got your HTTP routes and then the traffic split on top of it for each router. So that would definitely be a breaking change for sure.
I mean, I'm broadly in favor of the kind of the single definition, because I think it gives you complete clarity about what's going on. rather than having to look at like a number of different resources. I think there's there are pros and cons, and I can't remember exactly, but I do remember having a conversation around this in terms of traffic splitting when we were originally kind of coming up, and there was two camps. One was around the sort of the easy to read single configuration, and the other was around reusability. And I think in that instance, reusability won, but I'm kind of like, I see the side, both sides. I think easy to read is, in my humble opinion, something that I would favor over reuse, because copy pasta. It depends on each use case, right? I mean, sometimes that's not the right thing to do, but yeah, I think we can make it work. I do think there will be definitely breaking changes. To your point around parent ref, actually in the issue, that was one of the things that I called out. I'm like, actually, parent ref it seems to be just loose. It doesn't seem to have any restricted types. So actually, I think service identity could be something that we have as parent ref.
That's exactly what I was thinking might be the identity binding as a parent ref might be a really nice way to handle it.
Yeah, and I think like, actually I put that in the mock-up as well. I think it can work. I think that the only thing that was holding me back, which I was like, I wasn't sure, was could I take that HTTP route specification, and could I create the necessary, in this instance, my brain's thinking console configuration to do what it says. And I think I probably could, but without trying it, I couldn't be absolute. I just think it's the right thing to do, but let's thrash that out. And as I say, hopefully we can have an issue on this. We can get service identity merged, moving to KubeCon in the summer, and then I think really if we did that, we could go beta. I would literally push beta, because the difference between alpha and beta is a big enough semantic jump that people would expect breaking change.
I think so. I think with something like this, it's definitely important to to communicate it. I think we are, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, we definitely want to make sure people have time to like weigh in on the paradigm shift and adjust their kind of mental model, their domain model of, what resources exist, what your domain objects are kind of within your mesh, within your network. But I agree with you, Nick. I think that whether it's the flatter manifests and heightened readability and just overall simplicity, I think I'm in favor of the change. And I think looking at the pros and cons, I think the pros outweigh the cons. Just to be on the same page with the larger ecosystem. So I will, I know that's a bit, I don't know if you're taking notes, but thank you. So yeah, I'll go ahead and plan to start attending the SIG Networking 2 Gateway API meetings and try to get the topic of identity binding and SMI on their agenda, because it definitely seems like there's interest on that side. To Mike's point earlier, I think we can get some good stuff done. Like once you've got more, I guess, formal buy-in on their side, we can look for buy-in on our side as well. Okay, Mike, do you have any other follow-up points to your topic?
No, I think we talked most of it. Let's move on to identity binding.
Awesome. So the identity binding PR was submitted, and let me try to go ahead and share my screen, because I think it might make discussion simpler. Let me do this and this. Can everybody see that? Awesome. This is the PR. Had a couple of really good comments from Stefan and you, Mike, around pod label selector versus service account. So this is something I didn't notice when initially designing it, but it's allowing the service account to be specified as well as pod label selectors is a bit of a contradiction, because then with you have pods with those labels who might not have those service accounts, and you've kind of violated the promise that you've got in the service account section if you allow for pod label selector in addition to that. So, the idea is for all of the different schemes identity binding to be ORed together. So if you've got the spiffy identity or this label or this service account, then you count, as this identity. But I do see the security implication of, oh, well, I want it finished with this service account, but this pod label selector doesn't have a service account. So perhaps what we do is to, I mentioned in there, maybe we make pod label selector and service account mutually exclusive. That way you can either kind of tie yourself to a loose identity based on pod labels. You do this if you've got something like Istio, which has secure naming, or and spiffy to kind of validate both sides, and you can have that looser piece of identity. Or you can tie yourself to service accounts and get all the guarantees and richness that comes with Kubernetes service account model. But you can't do both because they, in a way, inherently contradict. I want to get some thoughts on that and Stefan's broader point. Nick, I think you're muted.
Yeah, the core kind of issue for me is, can I create? Let me reverse that. I should not be able to define an identity binding for a workload that I don't own. So identity binding should be, like as the creator of a service, I should be the only person that can create that identity binding, because I'm kind of defining what my service is and what my workload consists of. So if you apply that rule, I should be able to do that however I choose to do so. Now, there's a caveat to that, which is around, is it possible for somebody else to create a workload with specifics around pod selectors? And can I put a different pod selector? Sorry, could I add a pod selector and then end up masquerading as a workload? And I think that's the kind of the core caveat. So I think we kind of said, though, that pod label selectors were, well, it's all limited to a namespace, wasn't it?
Yes.
So for a service identity, because the service identity is completely namespaced, as would be the pod label selectors and as would be the service accounts, then in reality, the control falls back into standard Kubernetes. I could be wrong about this, and back into standard Kubernetes RBAC, which is, if you can do something in a namespace, you're good to go. Mm-hmm. So would that?
I don't think the pod label selector violates that. I think we're good because it's explicitly declared that the identity binding is namespace specific, and that if you want, and I called it out in the documentation, that if you want to like replicate things, multiple namespaces, like for monitoring or things like that, then you create a separate identity binding in each namespace.
Yeah.
If you think about identity binding as being a service identity, services are also namespace specific, right? It's part of the FQDN for a service.
Yeah.
So you duplicate the service, duplicate identity binding. You keep saying it. I wonder if service identity might not be a better name for this. But maybe. But to Stefan's point, I don't think we're violating a security model per se, but I do wonder about, like, it seems like a contradiction, almost. Like,
if you bind the same pod to multiple service accounts, you can't.
You're right. You can't bind the same. I guess that's I think his issue is with the or-ness. So if as far as what do I consider a member of this service, as an operator, as an owner of this service, I can say anything with the service account or anything with this pod label.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that that's wrong. It's not necessarily intuitive. I don't know that I recommend somebody use both.
So let me throw another question at you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a more theoretical one, which might kind of tidy things up and kind of just stop some things. But would you ever do that? And I think, like, whenever I ask the question, would I ever do that? And in my mind, the answer is no. Then I can almost guarantee you then somebody will. But realistically, what I mean is, I could see you wanting to select workload from multiple service accounts because you might want to do like a combinative service.
Mm-hmm.
You might have V1, V2 or something, and you want to kind of combine it into like or something. I don't know, but
like a mirrored service or something like that. That's giving traffic, but has different access. Yeah.
Yeah, and likewise with you might be doing some A/B testing or something like that, and you just want to randomly load balance across multiple versions. And I can see you wanting to do that with a pod label selector. You might say anything that has app equals API, and that could be a number of different pods. But I honestly, I think you would probably, I can't give myself a reason why I would use service account and pod label selector. So maybe what we could do in terms of the schemes is make it scheme, but make the selector an OR. So you have to choose whether you want to select from the service account, Spiffy ID, or pod selector, but you can have multiple selection rules. Does that help things, or does that keep us in exactly the same position?
I think my concern with, and I might not have understood you completely, but I think my concern with forcing you to choose one of N of the schemes is that you kind of lose the composability. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'm running a workload on a VM.
I don't think it helps with the problem, actually, to be honest with you, when I kind of think through it. I think it keeps you you're in exactly the same. But like, I don't think this is a problem. Like, I need to get my head around.
Yeah, the only thing I could think of, and it would be, I might ping him in the SMI Slack to ask for clarification. But the only thing I could think of is like the idea that, if I want to bind this to a service account and a pod label selector, then you kind of violate service account guarantees. But again, but to your point, Nick, like, why would you do that? I mean, it does violate it. Your goal is to use one or the other. And the thing with Spiffy is the reason why I plan for multiple schemes and to be open spec for it is like maybe you're running with a federated trust domain and you've got some external clients that you want, you're running it on the edge instead of or on a cluster, or you're running it on a VM. And the trust domain, for the Spiffy ID isn't cluster.local, it's something else. Maybe you're running Spire, that's going to issue it with its own specific trust domain. And you want to still consider that a part of your service. So your mesh can look at that identity and say, okay, I'm going to trust this as the SNI as well as the cluster.local one, right? That was one of the main reasons for Spiffy identity, and like the idea was for the spec to grow.
I mean, I think we have to use Spiffy identity because I'm pretty sure that's the primary mechanism that Linkerd uses. So like with console uses Spiffy identity. You don't choose your Spiffy identity.
Right.
So your Spiffy identity is like random string dot service name dot cluster dot something data center dot. It's something that you can get. Like you can get it, but it's certainly not something which is exposed to the end user. Now, I think the benefit of having Spiffy identity is wildcard, because if you follow that sort of, everybody implements the hierarchy within Spiffy differently, but there is a hierarchy that is meaningful to you and your workload. Yep. So whether you're using cluster.local/namespace, maybe what you would do is cluster.local/namespace/star or something, or you might have, I want to allow everything from this data center or cluster, but only this one. And then I think it depends again on the service, like what you're doing. It's not always that there's a very tight kind of trust model. Sometimes you have a service which needs lots of things to be able to communicate with it. Login is one such example. So,
right. And the thing with identity binding is that it's not explicitly service. You can kind of have like a pseudo service, if to your point, where it's like, okay, I want to allow everything from the default namespace. That's going to be identity binding. And you can't really do that with pot label selector or service account. You could do that with Spiffy though, and say, okay, if you with a wildcard and say, okay, anything from this namespace, that's kind of as the pseudo identity that you can then use for your access rules, right? That you get that kind of flexibility that you didn't have before.
So let's think about this as in terms of workflow. So for example, if I was going to create a traffic target, which is restricted to service identity, it is only the owner of the inbound or the destination that should be able to create that rule. That thing. So that's again, it's namespace bound. So and I think that's interesting. We've got like namespace in both destination and in traffic target, because I honestly feel that access is something that the owner of the service grants and other people request. So you shouldn't be able to create a traffic target which tells your service to talk to my service. It's only me who has the privilege to do that.
Right.
So then we get into like identity binding for the sources. And I think namespace is open on that. Who creates
the namespace is a reference to the namespace of the
identity binding.
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
the identity binding. Yeah.
So who then creates the identity binding for the source? Let me like, I'm just trying to like think, is there a situation where somebody can abuse it? Because look at this. This is what I mean. So in terms of I think it should be fine. Like, so you have a service API and I have a service payments, you want access, your API needs to call payments. So I set up a traffic target that allows your source. I own the identity binding and the traffic target for payments.
Mhm.
If you should then potentially own the identity binding for API because that's your domain.
Yes. Yes.
If you choose to change that and to bring in other pods, it's fine because it's within the namespace. And if you're running restricted namespaces, it's like, I think you're kind of like, that's fine, right? I mean, is it? Mike, can you think of like a way where that would be open for abuse?
So I think that as long as you're restricting things to like the owner of the service within a namespace is creating the things that allow incoming rather than like point to outgoing things, that you're relatively safe.
So yeah, because in console, if we did the same thing, so for example, we've got two services. So we use service account in Kubernetes to provide the identity of the service. But it's up to me as the owner of the service to what I can apply that service account to. So like I could put my service account on a completely different pod. I could have it on my API. I could also have it on my currency service. And in terms of console, what console would do is it would basically say, well, all of this workload is this service, and it would break, but it would still be legal, right? Because the identity is based on the service name, not and again, that level of trust is fine. And if you want to really go tight, then it's up to the operator to say that only single workload can operate in a namespace, and or you can apply some OPA or something like that to kind of tighten it down. So I think this is fine.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to, as long, like you said, I envision identity binding as being like one-to-one with a service account. Like you create a new service, you create a service account for that service. You should also create identity binding for that service. And so I'm able to reference the identity binding, the service account of a service I want to allow to talk to my service. That's because it's all happening server side anyway. So that's fine. And then I think that, if a cluster operator, some admin wanted to create kind of, we talk about this in the case of Spiffy, if they want to create some sort of pseudo identity for every workload in this namespace or whatever, they could do that with just Spiffy, or, depending, you do scheme specific things that your mesh is aware of if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, it could be different cluster different cluster. It could be different. It might not even be. I mean, in Istio's and Console's case, it might not be Kubernetes workload.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You could do VM extensions in Istio, and you could be a VMDC in Console.
And that's where I think like the Spiffy selector is really interesting, because it can serve to identify a specific console service on a VM somewhere as an alternative to the service account, where the service account works for console services that are registered in Kubernetes stuff.
Yeah, and that was the main reason for including it, because it allows us to break out of that Kubernetes specific shell.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure Linkerd uses explicit Spiffy IDs as a selector around the security model, so that will satisfy. So I'm wondering then, maybe we should have in the PR, maybe we should have some. I mean, we can't enforce this, but maybe we should have some guidance that kind of states that, in terms of ownership of objects and kind of just put some guidance around the fact that we should follow role-based access best practices, and that ingress can only be allowed by the workload owner. So therefore the traffic target would be owned by the same people who own the destination service identity. And the only people that can create a serviced identity are those who own the namespace for the workload. And maybe just that guidance will help help things up. And I think in the controller, in the controller SDK, I'm pretty sure we can codify that and enforce it at an application level, because we can kind of check, when somebody's submitting a traffic target, and we can do some validation and stuff like that, just to make sure before we even hand it off to the destination service mesh. But maybe that would help. I don't know. Like, in my mind, I think this is no worse model than.
Yeah, so we're 5 minutes past time. Don't want to keep you all, but I'll follow up with this and ask, maybe ping Stefan in Slack to see if we can't get more specific understanding. But I think that this conversation was good to kind of validate the kind of threat model, the security model of what people are allowed to do. And that guidance is useful. I'm going to add that regardless, because I think that having that those kind of guardrails around how it's supposed to be consumed can be really helpful for operators and users. So yeah, I'll do that. Go ahead, Ty.
The bottom line, I think, is that you've obviously got two layers of security, and some people are interested in the administrative control, and I think we satisfy that. But I think ultimately as well, the fact that you reference the schemes and that you're configuring your services to talk with TLS and are authenticating with MTLS is still a kind of, you're stepping up your transport level security as well, so I think I think it works. But I think Stefan's going to have some really interesting points. I'm not dismissing Stefan's opinion in the slightest. So I think that's a good plan.
Yep. All right. Sounds good. And I'll get to the rest of these comments. Mike's got some really good clarifications and typo stuff that I'm going to address as well. All right. If there's nothing else, we can go ahead and adjourn.
I think it's getting really close. It's going to be cool. We can get this.
Yeah, getting it merged. Yeah.
That's good.
All right.
Thanks,
See y'all.
y'all.
All right. Later. Bye.
Bye.